Today, I want to talk about the idea of structural violence. What is structural violence? You will also hear me use the term sacrificial violence, which, in some sense, we're talking about the same thing, just emphasizing different aspects of the same social phenomenon. This is in the discussion of anthropology, which is the study of human species, society, culture, how culture emerges, all these different things. Logos, right? Logos means the truth, the word, right? And then you have anthro, which means man, the truth about man. Jesus Christ said he's the Son of Man. He is the way, the truth, and the life. So he's going to reveal to us what it means to be human, not just what it means to be human as walking, isolated individuals that popped out of a vacuum with our own intact desires, but rather what it means to be human in the Trinitarian sense. Because we are human persons, distinct. But just like the Trinity, there is both persons, but also society in one being, in one Godhead. That's the mystery of the Trinity that reconciles the whole world's grasping at truths into a way that actually makes sense with the nature of human beings and the nature of the world. Human beings are both persons, distinct, but also shaped by the desires of those around them. Just like with the Trinity, three distinct persons, but mutually indwelling interrelationally with one another through self-giving love. That means putting self to the side and looking at what the other person needs and giving love and relationship. And that concept is the best human beings have been able to grasp mentally, it seems, about the nature of who God is. He is both singular, one God, but also having society in his being. Just like, and that's the only account of God that we know of that explains the real truth of human desire. That human beings have personhood, they have distinct personalities, and they have free agency. They have free volition in the sense of being able to choose what they want and choose how they act and choose in the moment whether to forgive or escalate an insult or a slight or a disrespect. But they're also interrelationally, what we would call interdividually, as some people have called it, interdividually shaped, meaning their relationships around them shape who they are and their sense of who they are. We just don't want to recognize that because we want to believe that we are self-created fully. And that's just not true. We are interrelationally shaped. Our desires are mediated by those around us. You look at someone's son and they're so giving and kind and sharing and very generous and give their shirt off their back. And they say, well, it's just what I feel the right thing to do, which is fine in and of itself. And the way it expresses itself is unique to them on the particulars. But in the grand scheme of things, you look at their family, you can see maybe their father or their mother was extremely that way as well. Generous, kind, loving, sharing, giving their shirt off their back, giving the car, whatever it was. And so we have this kind of forgetfulness where we don't want to reconcile, who we are. Oftentimes, the only time we want to point to somebody else shaping us is if we want to blame parents or somebody else for making us do bad choices or bad habits that we've picked up along the way. But the bottom line is that so much of the best things about us are also completely constructed by those that we imitate unconsciously around us. The ways of thinking, the ways of desiring, the ways of relating, the ways of forgiving, the ways of competing, the ways of looking at money, the ways of looking at possessions, the ways of looking at ourselves, the ways of looking at health. All of those things are so shaped by those around us, models around us. It's endless almost in what it means about the construction that we call ourself. That's what the Trinity helps us see. The Trinity helps us see how we are, and how we are helps us see that we're the viceroy. We are the image of God in relationship to planet Earth. And therefore, we're an extension of God. Through the incarnation, we're reconciled back into the relationship of the Trinity in a complete way through Christ as the mediator between the Trinity in ourselves as an extension, as an image made like God in earth. So I want to unpack what I tweeted out um, as of April 22nd, 2024. Sacrificial violence after Christ's destruction of myth and structural violence is binding only creates more schism, anger, and bad blood in community. That's why until a society recognizes the individual guilt of its acts of violence, gender, class, race, and other boundaries will dissolve into rivalry and violence. So let's talk about sacrificial violence and structural violence. The same thing, different aspects of the same thing. Let's start with the best description known to political philosophy, which is Caiaphas, who said when he was saying that it's right that we should kill Christ, he said, "It is better that one man die than that the whole nation perish." This explains the sacrificial violence concept in a nutshell. This also explains the structural violence, which again are talking about two separate things. The sacrifice is that you don't take your rivalry out on your neighbor, you take it out on a vicarious common enemy that we all agree upon is causing too much trouble, causing too much mischief, causing too much bad blood, stirring up too much problems that needs to be eliminated. And when you eliminate them, it creates the sacrificial catharsis. That sacrificial catharsis is an experience that people have psychologically and in their being. So not just of the mind, but their full body in relationship to other people, of release, of togetherness, of being bound together. So the word structural violence is what happens when you have a successful, somewhat successful sacrificial act of violence. Sacrifice one, it cleanses the bad blood of everybody who are at each other's throats socially in a state of alienation and bitterness and division. It resolves the tension within the community because they were able to distinguish themselves as so much alike in relationship to their common hatred or their common fear or anger towards their scapegoat, their sacrificial victim. Christ comes into history and destroys that. He destroys it not through an ideological imposition of brainwashing like every other political philosophy ever conceived by man, but rather he destroys it by taking it on from within, incarnating the lie, exposing it through the truth of the gospel, and saying that I will draw all men unto me when I am lifted up. Because when he is lifted up on the cross, he exposes the heart of culture making, of society itself, of religion, as man conceives of it, and he exposes it for what it is. It allows us to exit that satanic system of casting out one another to create order. Allows us to exit out of that eternal return, the eternal cycle of history that the pagans were lost in. They had no concept of the future. The future was only going back to the golden age. It was just a cycle, just trying to get back to the best of the years, which were always behind us. That nostalgic sense is the best the pagan world could ever conceive of prior to Christ breaking through that machine by exposing it step by step, the ways in which people select a target for sacrifice, exposing it nonviolently, unveiling the truth of it, saying, you do not know what you're doing when you do this. And by doing that, and by showing it for what it was, becomes this irresistible power that draws all men unto him. I find this to be the most exciting thing, and I wish that there was a way that we could help more and more people understand this deep truth of the gospel. This is the revelation that's found in the Bible. And it's found in the stories that we tell about Jesus in oral context. How this story of the gospel shapes the way we treat one another in our societies 2,000 years after these things happened. And Jesus said, it's finished. So get to work, as he basically suggests. It is finished. Get to work. Get to work doing what? Baptizing nations, helping them to understand. Baptizing nations doesn't mean baptizing individuals. That's part of it. But if you baptize individuals without baptizing the communal structure, the communal leaders, the mimetic role models and institutions around that nation, you will inevitably just create outcasts who will be expelled, who will not be absorbed into the society without extreme persecution and rejection opportunities. So we have to baptize nations. That means individually, but more importantly, structurally, socially, communally. And we haven't done that because we don't understand that the gospel is an effect. It's an effect of on our perception, not just a mental model. We are so Cartesian, it's sick. We are so dualistically Cartesian. I think blank, therefore I am a Christian. I think it's this doctrine. I think it's this church. I think it's that local thing. I think it's this baptism. I think it's this diet. That's what makes me distinct as in being with God, rather than understanding that what God does through Christ's work in history changes our perception of the way we relate to one another in ways that we're not fully aware of, even till this day. That's how explosive the revelation of this story is. So structural violence is what we call violence that is trying to structure and generate order from temporary chaos. You sacrifice someone and you create order. Ancient societies had festivals and carnivals where they would have a controlled, marked out sacred time in which people could lose all gender, class, or other boundaries. Power boundaries were eliminated. Everything was left into a kind of undifferentiated state. Plato talked about it. Everybody talked about it around the world in different ways. This primordial chaos that is then resolved with an act of sacrificial violence, purging somebody that then is then remembered hundreds of years later, thousands of years later as a god. So structural violence is creating structure in society and order through limited violence against someone or some group of people that can't fight back and create revenge cycles. Of course, it doesn't work today. If one president is indicted, he's still going to have millions of followers that get more and more loyal to him no matter how many times you try to indict him. It won't create unanimous consent that this person is deserving of being seen as truly guilty of being a structurally violent person. That's where we get into the concept of structural innocence. So one could say, let me give you an example of what I mean by that. Someone could steal a few, a few $50 of food because they're starving, right? And they steal it from a grocery store. And a society gathers that person together and says, you know what? We're going to put them in prison for the next decade, 10 years. We're going to put them in a prison amongst people with seasoned, violent behavior. This person has not had any evidence of any violence on that level. This is a low-level offense. We're going to put them away for 10 years, or we're going to banish them from the community and strip them away from their family and children. I know that sounds like an extreme case, but we could give many examples that are very much like that around our society every single day if you only have eyes to see. But when you do that and you put a trial together and you say, there's the evidence, they did this action, they deserve to be banished and punished, this person is what's causing the disarray in our local village, just expel them, destroy them, take them away from their family. They may be guilty of the actual act, but they're not structurally guilty as we want to make them. We want to use them as a vessel of being purged. Some of the things that they were suspicious towards Christ doing, that he was changing the boundaries about what was considered to be clean and unclean, what was considered to be in versus out. Some of the things that they were concerned about him were things he actually did, but it didn't mean that he deserved to die so that the whole nation would not perish. There are many people who do drugs or sell drugs or drive a car that sell a drug or that distributes drugs that don't deserve to be locked away for decades and decades of their lives. But they are, because we find that to be a kind of cathartic structural violence that is necessary to create order in the thin blue line. But what we don't realize is that doing such things 2,000 years after Jesus Christ destroyed this system and exposed it creates only chaos and guilt and resentment and revenge. Because, again, you cannot, in order for mythology to work, in order for sacrifice to work, the monopoly of violence must be maintained. People truly must believe the person who is being presented as the public threat, the enemy of the people. They truly must be able to see and truly believe that this person is fully guilty and is truly deserving of being punished in that kind of structurally violent way. But people don't see that after 2,000 years of being catechized, being taught that it is better that one man die, perish, that is the voice of the persecutor of that which is holy and sacred. This upends the entire situation for all societies that experience this story, because everything Jesus Christ does in his life and everything his followers do in the New Testament is all pointing to this reality, and everything in the Old Testament is pointing to that ultimate reality embedded in the word of Jesus' life and his actions. So you can't undo it. You can't go back. That's why the attempts to go back to Nietzschean violence is insane, because you can't roll that back. That's why Nietzsche went insane. You can't forget the horrors of our history. But the other side, the leftist move to try to create more horrors and more violence and more sacrificial violence, which was some kind of holier than thou zeal because one does their acts of violence in the name of victims, that too is not perceived as unanimously good and structurally violent and necessary. With every action the left does, which is brutal and violent, like subsidizing an endless war in Ukraine, or whatever else that Republicans and Democrats subsidizing endless war in Israel with Gaza, all these different conflicts, you cannot get away from the fact that it does not create unity. It does not create a shared sense of, aha, we finally vanquished the foes. We are all united in peace and resolution with one another. We can maintain our boundaries in a safe and healthy way. That no longer works. That's what I call the impotence of sacrifice. No matter how long you put people away, you can lock people up away from their children for decades, for this drug, for that drug, for being friends to this person, for taking a piece of mail to the mailbox, for being late on child support, for selling raw milk like the Amish, all these folks that go to prison for all these nonviolent things. You can throw every one of those people away, and it's not going to change the effect that the gospel has had on our society, which is that millions of people, or even if it's a small community of only 10 people know it, that at least half or somewhat around that will believe that this is an unjust action. Because people see it. The more they see it, the more they realize it. Now, does that mean that people are aware of this stuff? A lot of people don't even understand that people get arrested for raw milk. They don't care. They're callous. They're ignorant, foolish, whatever. They're just walking around. But once you see it, it exposes, oh, wow, that same event that you see, this new event, you never thought of people going to prison for selling raw milk. Now you see it filtered through the worldview of 2,000 years of cultures generationally passing down Christ-haunted, Christ-saturated sensibilities in the way we treat people. Wait, putting someone in a rape cage because they sold raw milk? That viscerally doesn't feel right to a Christ-haunted society. So the only way that kind of evil can persist is that people avert their eyes through ignorance, through media deception, through clever justifications. Oh, well, if we let them sell raw milk, everybody will die from raw milk. I mean, it's the stupid, it's always has to be coded in the name of a victim for it to continue this kind of structural violence. But it doesn't create unity. It only creates more division because we don't agree. The only way the social phenomenon of structural violence works is when everybody truly feels satisfied because everybody truly believes in the guilt of the target being expelled or killed or hurt. And that's not possible anymore. That's how mimetic, that's how interdividual we are. We may have personhood and free agency, but we are communally structured. just as the Trinity is both persons and one God, but yet communally relating to one another. And you cannot roll that back in history. Christ has made that happen in history, and you have to deal with it. That's why you can't turn to reactionary stuff. You can't turn to rolling back. Let's have a monarch or let's have a Caesar. You can't roll back into history and pick a time and then transport it back into this moment, and then somehow that's going to solve the problem of the chaos that people are watching happen. The chaos is happening because people don't want to follow Christ. When he says God desires mercy, not sacrifice, no exception. You don't get to sacrifice an Israeli kid because you think they're a colonialist. You don't get to murder somebody for that. It's not for the greater good. Wrong. And when you do it, it creates chaos for your family and revenge. And in the same token, you cannot kill Gazan kids because they're under the rule of a Hamas group that your own government was funding for decades anyways. That doesn't create order. It doesn't create unanimity on the world stage. It creates chaos and schism and blowback. And it gives more power to your opponent you're trying to delegitimize through this violence. So at some point, humanity is going to wake up to what it's doing because it can only hide its violence with more and more clever displays of victimhood before it all just turns into a wash of resentments and jealousies and envies. And when that happens, that's where we're at today. That's where we're having these endless debates. It's amusing to me to watch. I'm not as involved in social media and Twitter as many people who have, these massive accounts and they're tweeting thousands of times. I don't tweet that much. I don't want to play the game so much. Play it, be in the world, not of the world. That includes social media ghettos. But it's interesting to watch the evolution of collective minds. These folks went through their little trad phase, or the right wing, and people who are dissidents of the establishment. We're going to have sourdough bread and fancy dresses and Instagram filters, and what we need is manhood. We need to go to the gym every day and chop wood, and that'll be. And then these kind of these are all good things in and of themselves. The exercise or chop wood if you need a fire. It's all good things, but this obsession with these external postcard representations of gender difference are not going to hold as long as a society does not look in the mirror and recognize the way in which it's continuing to perpetuate violence every day in an unjust, ungodly way. It will continue. The very act of keeping the drug war going, the very act of keeping these wars going, the funding of wars, the very act of keeping a Federal Reserve System going that destroys people's purchasing power, redistributing wealth from those who get the credit first, the oligarchs in Wall Street and the government agencies and their friends. They get the new money created first. Everybody else gets it later after prices go through the roof. The way in which it's obscenely absurd to pay for a home for a children and family to be raised in a safe way without having insane usury and insanely overinflated prices that benefit a few elites in different communities around this nation. All these things are built on violence, trickery, fraud. These are things that Christians can't continue to do to one another and hide their face and say, I don't understand it. It's not my thing. I don't understand politics. I don't understand economics. I don't understand theology. That excuse goes nowhere anymore. The violence is collapsing in on itself, and people can continue to hide in their postcard little nonsense things with sourdough bread Instagram filters and mustaches that are designed to be very trendy and mimetic to make it look like you're from the 1920s or something, to try to show, oh, look, this is what masculinity looks like. And femininity and all this stuff, that won't contain the chaos of resentments and rivalries that will continue as long as our society can't solve its problems, except going back to that same played out weapon of sacrificial structural violence that Jesus destroyed on the cross. He says it over and over again that mother will be against daughter, father against. All this means to say, what you see on Twitter right now, people whining, complaining, well, the men are crazy. They're wanting us to do insane things, and they're violent and resentful towards us. And then the men say, you guys are unworthy of being sacrificed, laying down our lives for you. And, oh, my goodness, you're not worthy of this, and you're not pretty or something. And all this stuff is a sign of what Jesus describes, that when you hear the gospel and you're affected by it and you don't change your society's ways, if you don't become a baptized society, if you don't transform and renew your minds collectively, it will persist in destroying the stability of differentiations like gender. You can see it in the left version, but it's in the right-wing reaction, because the right-wing reaction, without repenting of violence and sacrifice, as Jesus requires when he says God desires mercy, not sacrifice, which means if you desire sacrifice more than mercy, you must repent of it. If you're afraid of what you hear mythologically about why the government is needed to put people in rape cages for selling a drug, or whatever, all these other petty nonviolent crimes that we throw people away for, destroying their families with rape cages. If you think that's okay and you call yourself a Christian, I'm sorry, you don't understand how blasphemous you are, how against Christ you truly are in your spirit. But God is so gracious and mercy that he still works with you even in your deep ignorance, as he does with me. God desires mercy, not sacrifice, means you have to desire mercy, not sacrifice as well. That means you don't get to turn your eye away from people being destroyed and pulverized and their children weeping. You don't get to turn your eye away and say, well, I just need to do that because the other way would be scarier and more violent. No, if you think like that, you think like the persecutor of Christ, which is the entire point of the gospel, that you recognize that you yourself persecute Christ every day, that you persecute people like him. He said you killed the prophets, and you said you wouldn't have done it if you were there during that time, but yet you do. And your delusion is what persists in the chaos that we have all around us. I am trying to show you folks, and I don't care about these, everybody says you have to pick a category, pick an identity if you want to brand yourself. I don't have time for that. I'm just going to tell you the truth, and I'm going to apply it to the different fields of knowledge that I have interest in, that I think benefit us. That includes things like nutrition and health, medicine. That includes things like understanding wars and our proxy involvement. That includes economics. That includes physics. That includes new technologies. The things that I'm interested in, understanding, our immune systems, how they work. All of those things fascinate me, and that's what I apply this eclectic group of topics into various programs that we do. And I do it to my own branding deficit, because I get it. You have to stick some little gimmick that's very memorable and just run that gimmick and do your little grift off of that and hit your little algorithm and spend your whole life staring at a blue screen. I don't want to do that. I want to tell you these things, be in the world of the digital world, but not of it. And let the chips fall where they may. And Lord, have mercy that we can continue to get this message out faster. So racial differences will continue to break down into resentment. Class differences. Poor people now are just as, rich people are just as poor people, and poor people are just as rich people. You see what I mean? Everything's blending together. As you can, describe, the average person who is in deep, low poverty in America lives like a king times 1,000 compared to John D. Rockefeller, the richest man who ever lived, in terms of the benefits and technologies and things, tools that help him have easier life. But none of those things matter when a society persists in its delusion of not having a wake-up call about the truth of its violence. And the left pretends to be the prophetic voice on this, but unfortunately, so much of the leftist project looks to blame a group rather than blame and indict individuals universally. That's where personhood and community work together. Societies reap chaos societally. That's what the idea of curses are. It's not that God sits there and says, oh, because somebody in your society or majority of them want violence, I will terrorize your kids. No, it's that's the reaping what you sow of a society. If a society structurally wants to continue persisting in wars and horrible things, unfortunately, the consequence of that is that innocent people get hurt as a result of the chaos of employing impotent sacrifice in the forms of lying, fraudulent wars, lying, fraudulent money, lying, fraudulent medicine and medical care, lying, fraudulent justice system, lying, fraudulent wars, all those different things. You keep running that sacrificial machine and you keep pressing it and justifying it like Mike Johnson. I'm doing this for Israel. You're not doing it for Israel. You're doing it for violence. You're doing it for Satan. The accuser wants us to justify subsidizing people to their death. That's so sick. It's so disgusting. And until society altogether says, stop pointing at Democrat, Republican, stop pointing at libertarian, stop pointing at the communist, stop pointing at the white man, the black man, stop pointing at all this stuff. And realize the revelation of the gospel. Stop trying to run to Nietzsche and microwave stuff like that. That doesn't mean you can learn. You can learn little bits of stuff if you have a discerning mind. Most people don't. They're black and white thinkers. That's one thing I've learned about. Unfortunately, most human beings are very polarized thinking. You say one thing, they automatically think in a totalizing way. It's very disturbing. You make a nuanced critique and like, so you're saying we must do all this. If you critique democracy, so you're saying we must have monarchy. It's like, no. If you critique monarchy, so you're saying we must have democracy. Very binary, very stupid in the way people just, it's very frustrating for people who actually learn how to think the way Christ wants us to think and act. But that's where we're at, folks. If you make a criticism about, therefore all people are bad and indicted, we must hate those people. No. It's frustrating. Someone makes something really great point here, but then you accept their entire worldview with all their other stuff. That's totalizing black and white binary thinking. And it's got to stop. But that's all part of what ideology does, is it blinds us. It blinds us to our conscience, blinds us to our brains, blinds us to our love, our spirit. And so structural violence, I hope you understand structural violence now. I want to try to define these terms that I use so you can have a better understanding of what I'm saying. If you're new to the program or you've been watching the show and you forgot, we will continue to have more schisms, more breaking apart of families, communities, churches, social groups, friend groups. We will continue to have more unresolved anger. We will continue to have more bad blood and paranoia and resentment, as long as our communities continue to persist in this structural lie that it's okay to do these wars, these fiat currencies, all the different things. It's not just that. It's also the stuff that's not explicitly in the state. When you have camaraderie at your church because you talk about how great it is that you're not the other denomination that you guys don't like. That's not the Spirit of Christ that's binding you together in the meal. Even if you put crosses up, I'm sorry. You are speaking of a spirit that is not of God when you find camaraderie and togetherness by talking about how much greater your denomination is in relationship to the group that you used to be a part of or that you don't like. It's got to stop. That's not a healthy Christian binding force. So it's not just the big structural violence things I'm talking about, like the wars and those things. Those are huge. It's also the social things. Divorce is structural violence. You're sacrificing kids or sacrificing the other partner, sacrificing yourself in some sense because it blows up on everybody to try to create a new structure, to try to create a new order. And what people do when you make these statements is they always say, well, there's an exception here, there, and then therefore they don't want to have any meaning to anything anymore. But that doesn't work. These things are structurally violent to try to expel. Well, we're going to sacrifice those kids because the greater good is my fleeting sense of personal pleasure or joy or whatever it is that draws people to have such a cheap view of covenantal marriages. That's got to stop. So everything that we do in politics should be rolling back these attacks on differentiation, these attacks on our society in the form of violence, defrauding contracts. Having a one-size-fits-all, no-fault divorce structure is a structurally violent way, infringing on the contract concept as marriage was actually, or covenant concept as it was actually designed to be way before this country was founded. Same thing goes for your friend groups. If you have camaraderie with your friends because you talk about other people and put them down, I don't care if it's people online or people in person. If you find yourself finding the most joy and togetherness based on demeaning and diminishing other people, that's a sign that you have the same structural violent habit of mind and thought that reflects a society that creates fake, fraudulent money, economic theft with regulation, taxation, and inflation, and violence against families with destroying them with the drug war and mass incarceration, violence with the wars, violence with all these things. Structural violence is a real problem, and it is the heart of what we're dealing with in our society. And we're going to continue to have gender chaos resentment, class chaos resentment, race chaos resentment until we start to peacefully humble ourselves and let go of these practices. So we have to let go of those practices, repent of those practices, and at the same time, we have to tell art, we have to make good art that bears witness to the truth that God desires mercy, not sacrifice, that bears truth to the story that I will draw all men unto me by being left to die alone away from the community, telling truth that reflects that mystery, telling truth that reflects the mystery of reconciling the one and the many that is found in the Trinity itself, which reveals the interdividual relationship of ourselves as persons, not islands unto ourselves, as Enlightenment individualism says. These things need to be shown through art, living artful lives, and also making art that can be shared with others communally. Poems, movies, films, programs, radio shows, all of those things are great. And then the other thing we have to do is to use our imagination, our creativity, our hope and our joy, and our faith that God is good and He's created a good universe that can be relieved from the bondage to decay that it is in, by creating energy too cheap to meter, by creating abundant elemental transmutation without requiring destruction of the earth to mine resources and have wars and conflicts with people over those access to those resources. Creating endless energy that's decentralized allows us to bypass the energy oligarchs that predate and have so much power to blackmail and destroy and corrupt any kind of representation, because they're just so much more obscenely powerful, because they keep us in this false sense of scarcity and obscenely rich profiteering that they enjoy from that. We have to be able to use our minds, our heart, and our souls to serve our fellow human beings, to alleviate those pressure points which allow oligarchic power structures and structural violence dependent governance to continue to have its weak, its vicious, tyrannical control over people. Your families will have a harder time to be strong as long as we don't fight against that dragon. Fight against the structure of death. Why is it a structure of death? Because if energy is abundant and you don't need to fight wars over it, if you're killing people for something that shouldn't be happening, that's being in bondage to death. And if you believe you have to pay X amount of percentage of your life to some energy at some pump at the gas pump because it's artificially regulated and controlled to benefit a few, then you are living under the bondage of death. And if that stress and anxiety of trying to be enslaved to some, mortgage note is driving you away from your family, driving you away from community, driving you away from your best, your health, and you're living under the bondage of death. God doesn't want us to go through that. God actually wants us to break through that wherever the gospel goes. The gospel is about freedom on earth as it is in heaven. It's about heaven coming to earth, not earth trying to get the heck out of here to heaven. I don't care what, mistakes we may have heard. That's not at all. The gospel is not about getting away from earth. It's about heaven coming to earth through us and our actions. So that's it for today. I appreciate your time. You can email me hello@aneighborschoice.com. That's hello@aneighborschoice.com. We'll put it on the screen and in the description below if you want to stay in touch. Until next time, I'm David Gornoski. Godspeed.